At the age of 84, Paul Simon is still remembered as one of the greatest architects of modern American music, a man who has written melodies that not only exist on the charts, but are also deeply etched into the memory of many generations. From the 1960s, with Art Garfunkel, he created The Sound of Silence, Bridge Over Troubled Water, Mrs. Robinson, songs that not only achieved commercial success, but also became cultural icons. After going solo, he continued to affirm his position with albums of rare depth, such as Still Crazy After All These Years, and especially Graceland in 1986, a revolutionary work that brought South African music into the mainstream, helping him win many more awards and global recognition. Throughout a career spanning more than 6 decades, Paul Simon has won 16 Grammy Awards, been inducted twice into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, received the Kennedy Center Honors, along with countless Lifetime Achievement Awards. But above all, his greatest legacy does not lie in numbers or titles, but in the fact that he has become the voice of emotions that are hard to name, a storyteller through music that the world has not stopped listening to. Yet behind all those achievements is a journey that is far from perfect, where silence always accompanies sound, where every step forward carries a void that is hard to fill. As the years passed, the body began to betray the very person who once controlled every note, and hearing, the thing he depended on more than anything else, gradually became unreliable. There were sounds that were no longer clear, melodies that were broken, and the stage that was once the place where he felt most alive began to become the place he had to leave. The decision to stop touring was not a victory of choice, but an acceptance of an unchangeable reality. But what keeps Paul Simon's story from stopping at loss is his quiet will, a persistence that needs no display. He did not disappear, did not abandon music, but learned to exist with new limits, continued to write, continued to think, continued to seek meaning in what remained, and perhaps, precisely in that persistence, he still held on to the most important thing, not the ability to hear perfectly, but the ability to feel, which had guided him throughout his life, even when the music no longer sounded as before. Before moving on, please hit like and leave a heart, a small gesture to honor Paul Simon, the man who is still quietly walking as the music gradually leaves him. Please subscribe to the channel to follow together the journey behind the spotlight, where a person who was once listened to by the whole world is gradually learning to live in silence. Not everyone who grows up in a complete family feels they belong. And for Paul Simon, his childhood is proof of a kind of emptiness that is very hard to name, a silence that exists right in the middle of stability. He grew up in Queens, New York, in an intellectual family that from the outside seemed to lack nothing. His father, Louis Simon, was a university professor and also a bass-playing musician who understood music more through intellect and structure than emotion. His mother, Belle Simon, was an elementary school teacher, devoted and caring for the family in a quiet, persistent way. There were no big arguments, no violent incidents, but also no deep connection that a child sometimes needs more than anything. The house where he grew up did not lack books, did not lack music, did not lack clear principles about studying and life, but it lacked those moments when emotions were named, shared, and heard. The father was present like a standard, strict, quiet, and rarely showing warmth. He was not a bad father, but he was also not someone a child could easily turn to when needing comfort. The rare words of praise, the nods in place of recognition, all created an invisible distance that always existed. For a sensitive child like Paul, that silence was not just space, but a kind of prolonged question. Am I enough yet? Am I seen or not? The mother, with all her care, tried to fill those gaps with daily care, with small but regular things. But there are gaps that cannot be filled just by presence. There are things a child needs to hear, needs to feel, not just to be nurtured but to be understood. And precisely in those silences between father and mother, between quiet meals and wordless evenings, Paul gradually learned to keep his emotions to himself. He was not a noisy child, not someone who sought to attract attention. He observed, listened, recorded the world around him in a way that few noticed. Small details, subtle changes in voice, in eyes, all were kept by him like pieces of an inner world that grew deeper but also more closed. In class, he was not the center of attention. He did not seek to stand out, did not try to prove himself superior. He simply existed, quietly, like someone standing on the edge of his own life. And that feeling, the feeling of not fully belonging, followed him through his early years, not as a clear pain, but like a thin layer of mist covering everything. Music came to him not like a big dream, but like a refuge. When he held the guitar, when he tried to put words together, it was not to perform, but to understand what he could not say. The first melodies were not for others to hear, but for him to listen to himself. And, perhaps, from very early on, Paul Simon did not learn to live among people, but learned to exist inside himself. A world that was not noisy, not easy to understand, with the only place where he truly felt he existed, in the closed inner world that Paul Simon had learned to build from very early on. There was one person who stepped in not with noise, but with a natural presence that seemed to always belong there. And that person was Art Garfunkel. They met when they were very young, just two kids in the same neighborhood in Queens, going to school together, growing up together among familiar streets and unremarkable classrooms. There was no clear, fateful moment, no big event that marked it, but between them, a quiet bond formed, as if both recognized in the other something they could not find in the rest of the world. Art Garfunkel was taller, more standout, more confident in the way he expressed himself, while Paul was quieter, observing more than revealing. That difference did not push them apart, but on the contrary, created a strange balance, where each seemed to complete the missing part of the other. When they began singing together, at first it was just naive experiments, times standing in front of the mirror or in front of friends, but gradually, music became the only thing that made them feel truly connected. It was not ambition to become stars, not a dream of fame, but simply the feeling when two voices blended together, when the melodies became fuller with both of them. In those early years, everything was very simple. They wrote their first songs, performed in small places, shared with each other every opportunity. No matter how small, there was no competition, no comparison, only a shared belief that music was the only path they wanted to take. But right in that simplicity, differences began to form, very small, very hard to notice, but enough to exist. Paul was the writer, the one who sat for hours to find the right words, the melody that carried the exact emotion. Art was the performer, the one who stepped into the light and brought those songs to others with a naturalness that Paul never felt he had. When they were still in small spaces, that did not matter. But when their music began to attract attention, when the songs started to spread wider, when people began to call their names, then that difference was no longer a complementary part, but gradually became a distance. Paul saw his songs being sung, being loved, but sometimes he felt like he was standing beside his own work, as if the light was shining on another part of the story. Art, with his voice and presence, became the face that the public recognized more easily, loved more easily, and that, even if no one said it, still quietly created a feeling of imbalance. It was not jealousy in the simple way, but a feeling harder to describe, as if the deepest part of himself was not seen fully. The years passed. They still continued together, still wrote music, still performed, but between recording sessions, between trips, between conversations, there were silences beginning to appear. It was not big arguments, but things not spoken, thoughts kept to themselves. Art had his own ambitions, desires to try himself in other fields, like acting, as a way to affirm himself outside of music. Paul, on the other side, not only had to continue creating, but also had to face the fact that his companion was gradually stepping out of the space they had once built together. What made it all difficult was not the change, but the fact that neither of them really knew how to talk about it. They were still friends, still had shared memories, still had moments where just a melody rising was enough to make everything feel like before, but those moments became fewer. Instead, there was a prolonged silence, a distance that could not be measured but was always present. The friendship that had once been a refuge, that had once helped Paul feel he was no longer alone, now became a source of quiet hurt, because it did not disappear completely but only changed shape. And perhaps the most painful thing was not losing a friend, but seeing that person still exist in his life, but no longer standing in the position they once had. From very early on, Paul Simon had learned to live with voids. But this time, that void carried a name, a face, a voice that he would never be able to completely separate from. Success came to Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, not like a path built step by step, but like a door that suddenly swung open, pulling them out of small spaces and placing them into a world that both had not had time to prepare to understand. When the sound of silence began to play on the radio, when the halls grew more crowded, when their names were mentioned as a phenomenon, everything happened so fast that the sense of reality seemed pulled away from its original position. What had once been private, singing practice sessions, words written in silence, now became public property. And in that transition, there were things that no longer belonged to them. On stage, the two voices still blended as before, but outside the lights, the way the world looked at them began to change. Art Garfunkel, with his standout height, signature curly hair, and natural demeanor in front of the public, became the more recognizable image, the more easily loved one. He stepped in front of the camera with an ease that seemed effortless, while Paul, standing beside him, still carried his familiar reserve, as if the light was not where he belonged. That was not anyone's fault, but it created an imbalance that no one could clearly name. The songs, the core of it all, were still written by Paul. Every word, every melody filtered from the inner world he had built since childhood. But when those songs were sung, when they spread out, people did not always see the one who created them. They heard the voices, they saw the images, and gradually, in the public's eyes, the two people were no longer placed on equal footing the way they had once felt about each other. Paul was not someone who sought attention, but that did not mean he did not notice when recognition became skewed. In interviews, in articles, in the way people called their names, there were moments he felt like he was standing beside his own work, as if the most important part of himself was being seen through a different lens. The signs of imbalance did not appear immediately, but crept into every small detail. A longer look given to art, a question directed at him more, a casual comment that put the focus on the voice rather than the song. At first, all of it could be overlooked, because success was still there, the music was still playing, and they were still standing together on stage. But over time, those little things began to accumulate, becoming gaps that were hard to fill. Conversations between them were no longer as easy as before. There were things Paul kept to himself, not because he did not want to say them, but because he was not sure they could be understood correctly. Art, on the other side, was also going through his own changes, with new opportunities, different directions, experiences that were no longer completely tied to their music. And amid all that, what had once been the strongest connecting thread, music, began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just where they met, but also where the differences became clearer. Success, which they once thought would bring them closer, unintentionally created a distance that both did not know how to narrow. They still performed together, still completed projects, still created songs that the world loved. But behind those moments was a feeling that Paul could not shake. The feeling that he was gradually losing something important. Not the music, but the balance, the understanding, and the connection that had once made everything meaningful. And perhaps the hardest thing was not recognizing the change, but understanding that it was happening right before his eyes, little by little, with no way to stop it. The rift did not come in a single moment. There was no explosive argument to mark the end, but it came to Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel in a slower, quieter way, like a small crack gradually spreading in a seemingly solid wall. The working sessions, which had once been where they found harmony, began to carry tensions that were hard to name. Paul still sat for hours with his guitar and sheets of paper, trying to find the most exact words, the melodies that carried exactly the emotion he wanted to convey. For him, music was not just a product, but a part of himself, something that needed to be nurtured, protected, perfected to the point where there was nothing left to doubt. But on the other side, art was no longer there in the way he had once been present. Recording sessions were delayed, appointments were postponed, not because of a lack of care, but because Art's life was opening up in a different direction. Film, acting roles, new opportunities gradually took over his time and attention, pulling him out of the space the two had built together for many years. That was not a clear betrayal, but for Paul it carried a different meaning. He was not only losing a collaborator in work, but also losing the only person who truly understood how his music was created. The recording sessions no longer happened as before. There were times when Paul had everything prepared, every note and every lyric ready, but had to wait, not knowing when Art would come back, not knowing whether his focus was still intact or not. That waiting not only interrupted the work, but also eroded the feeling of connection. Communication between them began to change. Conversations no longer lasted long, no longer went deep into the things that had once bonded them. Instead, there were short, practical exchanges, enough to get the job done, but not enough to keep the closeness. There were things Paul wanted to say, but he did not know where to start, and gradually he chose not to say them anymore. Art, with his new pace of life, perhaps also did not realize that the distance was growing, or if he did not know how to close it. In the rare moments they stood next to each other on stage, everything could still return to how it was for a few short minutes. Music still connected them in a way no words could. But as soon as the lights went out, as soon as the applause died down, reality returned, and that distance was still there, clearer than ever. Paul began to feel like he was walking alone on a journey that had originally been meant for two. The songs were still written, still completed, but the process of creating them no longer brought a feeling of wholeness. He was not only working more, but also carrying on his own the parts that had previously been shared. The silence between them was not a peaceful silence, but a void full of things left unsaid. There was no official end, no definitive statement that everything had stopped. Instead, the friendship that had lasted from childhood, which had once been the center of both their lives, gradually dissolved in a way that no one could point to an exact moment. It could have been when the recording sessions became rarer. It could have been when conversations no longer carried the same meaning as before. Or it could have been when both realized they were no longer standing in the same place. For Paul, losing Art was not like losing a friend in the usual way. It was losing a part of himself, a part tied to his early years, to simple dreams, to the moments when he felt he was no longer alone. And what made it harder to accept was that the loss was not entirely clear. Art was still there, still existed in this world, still a part of the memories Paul could not separate from, but no longer stood beside him as before. That presence, both close and distant, became a kind of prolonged pain, not explosives but never disappearing. And perhaps, among all the things Paul Simon had been through, this was one of the hardest losses to name. Losing a friendship not by an ending, but by the gradual disappearance of everything that had once made it exist. The end of Simon and Garfunkel did not come like a door slamming shut, but like a room gradually dimming its lights, leaving Paul Simon standing alone amid sounds that were still unfinished. After the successes that any artist would dream of, songs topping the charts, packed concert halls, moments when their music seemed to touch every corner of life, the breakup came in a way neither of them had prepared for. There was no clear goodbye, only increasingly frequent absences, plans that were no longer carried out together, and a feeling that Paul could not deny. He was moving forward without the person walking beside him. When he officially stepped into the solo path, what he faced was not freedom, but a void larger than any stage he had ever stood on. Before, every idea, every melody had someone to test it with, to get feedback from, to make it more complete. Now, all of that remained only in an inner space that no one else could enter. The pressure to prove himself did not come from the public, but from Paul himself. He not only had to write good songs, but also had to prove that he could exist without the name that had been with him for so many years. The first albums in his solo career still received recognition, still had successful songs, but every time he was praised, every time his name was called, Paul felt something was not completely whole. Success was still there, but it no longer brought the feeling it once had. It was no longer something shared, but became a solitary experience, where everything happened around him but did not truly touch him the way it once did. There were performances where he stood in front of thousands of people, hearing them sing along to every word he had written. But the feeling of connection was no longer clear. He could no longer turn to the side to find a familiar look, a voice blending in to fill the gaps between the notes. Each song now began and ended with him alone, and that very thing made everything feel heavier, not because he was not capable enough, but because he had once known the feeling of not having to carry it all by himself. The people around him, the new collaborators, the musicians, all were professional, all understood their jobs, but none of them truly understood Paul's music the way Art had once understood it. No one knew where a lyric came from, what a melody carried, what a silence between two notes meant, and that very absence made Paul realize even more that success, when no longer shared, could become a form of loneliness. He continued to compose, continued to release highly regarded albums, continued to hold his place in the music world. But beneath it all was a feeling he could not escape, the feeling that he was standing in the very light, with no one there to see it with him. There were nights after the show ended, when the audience had left, when the sound had faded. Paul sat alone in the empty space, holding his guitar without playing another note, not because he had no more ideas, but because he was no longer sure who he was playing for. Before, whether it was the audience or just one person standing beside him, there was always someone his music was directed toward. Now, everything seemed to turn back to him, closed in a circle with no clear way out. And perhaps, what made Paul Simon's solo career special was not only the achievements he reached, but the way he continued to move forward on a journey where the most important part was no longer there. Success still came, but it was no longer the answer. It was only a part of the question he had carried since stepping out of the most important relationship in his life. When music was no longer the place where two people met, could he alone find himself in it, or not? After the stage lights went out and the applause died down, what remained for Paul Simon was not the relief of someone who had just finished a job, but a prolonged void where he had to face himself without any layers of protection left. If music had once been where he found balance, now it became the place that raised more questions than ever before. The pressure to create did not come from outside, not from the expectations of the audience or the critics, but from deep inside him, a demand that was never spoken but always present. He had to do better, he had to go deeper, he had to be more honest with himself. But the more he tried to meet those demands, the more he realized there was no clear stopping point, no moment where he could say that everything was enough. Each song completed was not an ending, but a beginning for a new series of doubts. He would listen back to what he had just written, and wonder if it truly carried meaning, or if it was just a subtle repetition of what he had done before. He would read over every word and feel as if they had not reached the place he wanted to reach, as if something important was still out of reach. And that very feeling made the creative process heavier over time. The gaps between projects grew longer and longer, not because he had run out of ideas, but because he could no longer easily trust his own ideas the way he once had. There were periods when he spent months, even years, just writing and then erasing, trying and then discarding, keeping very little of what he had started. To outsiders, that might look like a sign of perfectionism. But for Paul, it was a continuous struggle with himself. He did not want to make music just to maintain his presence. He wanted each work to have a reason to exist, to reflect a part of the truth he was trying to understand. But that truth was not always clear, and sometimes the very search for it led him into a loop with no way out. Inner thoughts began to dominate every artistic decision. There were no longer instinctive choices, no longer moments where he could simply trust his first feeling. Everything was weighed, analyzed, and held to a standard that even he could not clearly define. And in that process, music, which had once been a natural flow, gradually became a space he had to enter with hesitation. Success, with everything it brought, did not help him escape this state. On the contrary, it made everything more difficult. Each past achievement became a shadow he had to step past. Each piece of praise became an expectation he was not sure he could continue to meet. He did not feel safe in his own position because for him that position was not something fixed. It could change. It could disappear. It could lose meaning if he did not continue to find something new, something more truthful. And so he kept working. Not because he needed to prove anything to others, but because he had never stopped trying to understand himself. But that process did not bring peace. It only made the loneliness clearer. There was no longer anyone standing beside him to share the doubts, no longer anyone to give natural feedback. Everything turned back to him alone, and perhaps, among all the challenges Paul Simon had to face, living with his own mind, a mind that never stopped asking questions, never accepted easy answers, was one of the hardest things. When music became the only place where Paul Simon could understand himself, love was the place where he never really knew where to begin, and his relationship with Carrie Fisher was the clearest proof of that. They met at a time when both were used to being seen by the world, but rarely truly seen by a specific person. Carrie entered Paul's life with a completely different energy. Direct, sharp, unafraid to say things that others usually hid. With her, everything was clear, emotions were not hidden, thoughts were not held back, and that both attracted and confused Paul. He was used to keeping everything inside, used to observing more than reacting, used to transforming emotions into music rather than speaking them out loud. But Carrie did not wait for that. She wanted answers right then, wanted full presence, wanted a connection with no distance. At first, that difference created a strong attraction. Paul found in Carrie a part of the world he had never truly touched, while Carrie saw in Paul a depth she did not easily find in others. They quickly moved toward marriage, as if both believed what they were feeling was enough to overcome every difference. But time did not make those differences disappear. It only made them clearer. Paul remained someone who struggled to express himself, still kept his thoughts even when they began to create distance. Carrie remained herself, strong, straightforward, unwilling to accept silence as an answer. Their conversations did not always lead to understanding. Many times they only highlighted what they could not share. They loved each other. That was never the issue, but the way they existed in love was not compatible. The marriage ended quickly, not because of a lack of emotion, but because the emotion was not enough to keep two people in the same place. But that ending was not the stopping point. They came back to each other more than once, as if every time apart left a void that no one else could fill. The returns were not new beginnings, but the continuation of a story that had never been resolved. They tried in the ways each knew, but the old problems remained. Paul still could not say everything he felt. Carrie still could not accept the silences he carried. There were moments when they were so close it seemed everything had been healed. But all it took was one small misunderstanding, one word not said at the right time, and everything returned to its old place. What made this relationship painful was not the breakups, but the fact that both knew the love was still there. They did not drift apart because they stopped loving, but because they did not know how to love in the way the other needed. Paul, with his complex inner world, did not easily open the door for others to step in. And even when he tried, the way he expressed himself was still not clear enough for Carrie to feel it. Carrie, with her strong need for connection, could not exist in a space where emotions were not named. And between those two people, love became something both present and impossible to hold. Over time, they gradually accepted that being together did not bring the peace they were looking for, but that did not mean they completely let go. Their relationship did not end in the usual way, but shifted into another form of existence. There was still care, still memories, still what had once been very real, but it was no longer part of the present. For Paul, this was not just a past romance, but an experience that left a deep mark on how he viewed human connection. He had tried in his own way, but there were things that could not be solved by individual effort alone. And perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not losing someone he loved, but understanding that there were relationships that, no matter how hard you tried, could not last. Their love did not disappear, but it could not find a solid enough shape to stay. And among all the things Paul Simon had been through, this relationship was one of the clearest proofs that sometimes even the deepest emotions are not enough to keep two people together, if the way they exist in those emotions cannot harmonize. After the unnamed breakdowns and the long silences that even love could not fill, Paul Simon did not abandon music, but he began to see it in a different way, no longer as a place to seek success, but as a place to escape from himself. When what was familiar no longer provided answers, he turned to unfamiliar sounds, to cultures he had never truly stepped into. It was not a strategic decision, but more like a reflex, a way to search for something outside the boundaries of what he already knew too well. The trips to Africa, the sessions with local artists, the rhythms that did not follow the structures he had once been familiar with, all opened up a new space where he was no longer bound by old expectations. And from that, Graceland was born, unlike anything he had done before. The album was not just a musical shift, but also a way for Paul to confront himself from a different angle. The South African rhythms, the vibrant and energetic sounds, seemed to bring a sense of freedom that he had lost long ago. For the first time in many years, music was no longer the burden of perfection, but became a flow he could step into without needing to control everything. Graceland was quickly embraced, not only by audiences but also by critics, becoming one of the most important albums in his career, bringing many awards and worldwide recognition. But just like many other things in Paul Simon's life, this success did not come without its price. His decision to go to South Africa at a time when the country was still under international isolation because of the apartheid policy sparked major controversies. Many people believed he had violated the cultural boycott, that he had placed art above serious political issues. The criticism came not only from the press, but also from the artistic community itself. People who had once supported him. Paul was not someone who sought conflict, but this time he could not avoid it. He explained that his purpose was to work with the artists, to bring their music to the world. But not everyone accepted that view, and once again he stood in a familiar position, between recognition and doubt, between being praised and being criticized. What made this period complicated was not only the external controversies, but the way they reflected back inside him. Paul kept asking himself whether what he was doing was truly right, whether music could exist independently of the context in which it was created or not. But instead of stopping, he continued, not because he was certain, but because he had no other way to face those questions. Music, once again, became the only tool he had to search for answers. But this time it was not just expression but also dialogue, with the world, with those who disagreed with him, and most importantly, with himself. Graceland did not solve everything, did not make everything clear, but it opened a space in which Paul could continue to exist as an artist, even when he was no longer sure of his own position. The performances, the tours that followed, carried both admiration and skepticism. But he still stood there, still played his songs, as if music was the only thread keeping him connected to the world. And perhaps, in all his efforts, what Paul Simon was searching for was not consensus, but a way to keep moving forward without losing himself, even when that path was never completely clear. After Graceland, when the world called Paul Simon a symbol of creativity and rebirth, he himself stepped into a period where music was no longer an easy escape, but a space that demanded more than ever before. What had once come naturally now had to be pulled from a depth that even he was not sure he could still reach. The perfectionism that had always existed in him from the early days was no longer a simple drive, but became a prolonged, quiet, but relentless pressure. Each song began as an effort to search for truth, but rarely ended with the feeling of having found it. He would write, then erase, then rewrite, changing every small detail that others might never notice. But for him, each detail carried its own weight. There were songs kept for many years that were never completed, not because they were not good enough, but because they had not reached a standard that only he understood. The songwriting process therefore stretched out, not following any rhythm that the music industry was familiar with. Albums no longer appeared regularly, and each return was the result of a more complex inner journey rather than a clear plan. To outsiders, that might be the rigor of a great artist. But for Paul, it was a continuous internal struggle with himself. There was no stopping point, no moment where he could say that everything was enough. Each past success did not bring reassurance, but became a new standard, a shadow he had to step past, but never sure he could overcome. Praise no longer brought satisfaction, because it did not answer the question he kept asking himself, whether what he was doing truly touched the core or was just another version of what had already existed. That pressure came from no one else but from himself, and over time it grew larger, not because he wanted it that way, but because he did not know how to let it go. In the working environment, this gradually became a challenge not only for him, but also for those around him. Working with Paul Simon was not just participating in a music project, but stepping into a space where everything could be changed at any time, where nothing was considered finished until he felt it was truly right. That required patience, understanding, and sometimes the acceptance that there was not always a clear answer. Not everyone could stay in such an environment for long. They were collaborators who came and went, not because they were not capable enough, but because the process demanded a level of commitment that not everyone could maintain. And for Paul, that made the feeling of isolation even clearer. He did not intentionally create distance, but the way he worked, the way he thought, gradually placed him in a position that few people could truly enter. Success, with everything it brought, did not erase the inner lack. It did not answer the questions he was still carrying, did not make the creative process easier, did not make the doubts disappear. On the contrary, it made everything more complicated, because now every decision affected not only himself, but also a legacy he had built over many years. And amid all of that, what made Paul Simon's journey heavy was not that he had to keep creating music, but that he never allowed himself to stop at enough. He was not seeking perfection in a simple way, but searching for something deeper, a truth he felt he had not yet reached. But that very search, with no clear ending, had become part of the burden he had to carry, a burden that could not be fully shared with anyone, and also could not be let go. After the years when music was both a refuge and an endless source of pressure, Paul Simon's life seemed to shift into a different rhythm when he met and married Edie Brickell. No longer the intense clashes like before, no longer relationships built on the collision of two very different personalities. This time, everything came more quietly, like a pause he was not sure he had ever allowed himself to have. Edie did not enter his life with the need to change him or force him to become a different version of himself. She was present in a simple way, bringing a sense of stability that Paul had never truly experienced in the years before. They built a family, had children, and during those years, Paul's life no longer revolved only around the studio, the stage, or unfinished drafts. He began to spend more time on ordinary things, unhurried mornings, meals not interrupted by schedules, moments when he did not need to think about whether a melody was good enough or not. This stability did not come as a solution to everything he had been through, but it provided an anchor he could return to. In the role of a father, he faced a different kind of responsibility. Not responsibility to the audience or to his legacy, but to the little people growing up in his own house. That forced him to adjust the rhythm of his life, to learn how to be present not only in the big moments, but also in the small, everyday details. But even though life on the surface seemed calmer, what existed inside him did not disappear. The cracks that had formed earlier were not erased. They only became harder to see. The self-doubts, the unanswered questions, were still there, sometimes quietly, sometimes returning more strongly when he was alone. The difference was that this time he was no longer completely consumed by them. Family brought a point of balance, a reason for him not to let those thoughts take up all the space, but balancing between two worlds. Art and personal life was not something that came naturally. There were times he had to leave the studio to go home when an idea was still unfinished, when a song was not yet complete. And that was not always easy. There were times he was at home, but his mind returned to the music, to what had not been resolved. That tension was not a sign of failure, but part of him learning to live differently. No longer someone who existed only in music, he had to learn to exist in relationships that could not be controlled in the same way. With Edie, he found an understanding that did not need many words, an acceptance that he did not always have clear answers. But that did not mean everything became easy. There were days when the gap between the person inside him and the life outside became clear, when he realized that no matter how many changes there were, his nature had not completely changed. And perhaps the important thing was not to erase what had passed, but to learn to live with it. Family did not make the past disappear, but it changed the way he looked at it. What had once been a burden no longer carried the same weight when he no longer had to face it alone. In these years, Paul Simon did not become a different person, but became a version more capable of balancing the different parts of himself. Not perfect, not completely at peace, but enough to keep moving forward without losing everything he had built, both in music and in life. Time did not stop, and neither did music. While Paul Simon was learning to balance between family life and the unrelenting demands of his inner world, the outside world had quietly changed in directions where he was no longer the center. The melodies that once dominated the radio, the song structures once considered the standard, gradually gave way to new sounds, new trends, new generations of artists who grew up in a completely different context. Mainstream music no longer moved to the rhythm he had once been familiar with, and that did not happen suddenly, but took place slowly, little by little, until he realized he was standing on the edge of a flow that he had once helped shape. New names appeared, new styles were embraced, and the audience, those who had grown up with his music, also changed over time. They carried memories of Paul Simon, but they no longer turned to him as a current source of music. That was not forgetting, but a natural shift that no one could stop. Paul did not disappear, but he gradually appeared less in the media. No longer the familiar face in discussions about trends, no longer the name mentioned when talking about the future of music. His role changed, not because he chose it, but because time had placed him in that position. From someone at the center of every movement, he became a symbol, a name mentioned with respect, but no longer tied to regular presence. This did not come with a clear moment of realization, but arrived as a prolonged feeling, a change in the way the world responded to him. The performances still had audiences. The old songs were still loved, but the connection no longer felt immediate like before. There was no longer the sense that he was saying something the world needed to hear right now. Instead, there was a different relationship, where his music existed as part of the past, as a preserved memory rather than an ongoing experience. For many people, that was a respectable position. But for Paul, who had always sought relevance in what he did, it was a state that was hard to define. He never stopped composing, never stopped thinking, but the question of whether what he was doing still belonged to the present moment became clearer and clearer. There were moments when he looked at the music world around him and felt more like an observer than a participant, not because he no longer had the ability, but because the context had changed in a way he could not fully blend into. Innovation still happened, but it took place in different frames of reference, with values and languages he no longer completely shared. That did not diminish the value of what he had created, but it placed him in a position where he had to accept that he was no longer part of the main flow. The feeling of not belonging was not new to Paul Simon. He had carried it since childhood, from the early years when he learned to observe the world from a certain distance. But this time it carried a different meaning. It was no longer the feeling of a child who had not found his place, but the feeling of someone who had once stood at the center, now watching the world continue, without needing him in the same way. And in that change, he did not resist, did not try to force himself into a flow he knew he no longer belonged to. Instead, he stepped back, not as a surrender, but as an acceptance that his role had changed. But that acceptance was not entirely gentle. There were silences where he had to face questions about the meaning of continuing, about how to exist as an artist when he was no longer at the center of attention. And perhaps, right in those silences, he began to understand that not belonging to the current flow did not mean having no value, but was simply another form of existence. A form he was still learning to accept, day by day, in the silence he had grown familiar with, but had never been completely comfortable with. After stepping back from the flow of the music world was not the only thing Paul Simon had to face, because as time continued to pass, his own body began to send signals he could not ignore. And this time, it was no longer an external change, but a limit coming from within. For a person who had spent his entire life listening to the smallest details of sound, the decline in hearing was not just a medical issue, but a change that touched the very core of his identity. At first, those were only very slight signs. A few frequencies no longer clear, a few sounds fading in the space, things he could overlook or convince himself were not significant. But over time, those signs did not disappear. They became clearer, enough for him to realize that what he was facing was not temporary. In the studio, where he had once controlled everything with near absolute precision, everything began to change. Recording sessions no longer happened with the same confidence as before. There were times he had to stop. Not because he lacked ideas, but because he was not sure he was hearing everything exactly as it existed. The musicians around him still played, the melodies were still created, but the way he received them was no longer completely whole. That forced him to rely on other ways of working, to trust feeling more than hearing, to accept that he no longer controlled everything he had once mastered. On stage, this change became even clearer. The performances, which had once been where he felt the strongest connection to the world, now carried a layer of uncertainty. The sound from the audience, from the band, from his own voice, no longer reached him in a way he could fully trust. There were moments he had to rely on memory, on experience, on a familiarity built over decades, to continue through a song he no longer heard fully as before. That did not stop him immediately, but it changed the way he was present on stage. No longer complete naturalness, no longer the feeling that everything was happening fully in every moment. The body, in other ways, also began to no longer respond to the intensity he had maintained for many years. The long tours, the packed schedules, the consecutive nights on stage all gradually became more difficult, not because he lost the will, but because the body could no longer keep up with that will as before. And then, the decision to stop touring came in 2018, not as a big announcement, but as a quiet acceptance. For many people, that was a milestone in his career, a closing of a chapter. But for Paul Simon, it was a moment when he had to face a truth he had avoided for a long time. There were things that, whether he wanted it or not, would no longer be as before. Leaving the stage was not just stopping performing, but letting go of a part of life that had defined him for decades. No more nights standing in front of thousands of people. No more moments when music and people merged in a shared space. Instead, there was stillness. Not the stillness he had once sought in songwriting, but a different kind of stillness, where he had to learn to exist without relying on what had once been the center of his life. Facing his own limits was not something anyone could do easily, especially for a person who had grown used to pushing past those limits throughout his life. But this time, there was no way to push past, no effort that could bring everything back as before. The only thing he could do was accept, not as a surrender, but as the next step in a journey he could not fully control. And in that acceptance, there was a profound change, from trying to maintain what had been, to finding ways to understand what remained, and how to live with it. After leaving the stage and accepting the limits his body imposed, Paul Simon's life gradually shrank into a smaller, quieter space, where everything was no longer dominated by schedules or spotlights, but by the slow rhythm of ordinary days. He did not disappear completely, but his presence became rare, no longer the frequent appearances in public, no longer back-to-back performances, no longer long interviews where he had to explain his music. Instead, there was a carefully guarded private life. As if after many years standing before the world, he had chosen to step back to exist in a space no one else could enter. His days no longer began with preparing for a show or a trip, but with simple habits, moments without the pressure to create something. There were mornings when he sat alone, not to write music, but to think, to look back at what had passed without needing to turn it into a song. The past was no longer material for composition, but became a flow he observed from a distance, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, but always present. Memories of his early years, of recording sessions, of stages he had left behind, did not disappear, but they no longer carried the same weight as before. They existed like pieces of a story that had been completed, even if not everything had a fully whole ending. Old relationships, especially with Art Garfunkel, were not rekindled in the way many had once hoped. There was no complete reconciliation, no return to how it had been. What had happened between them was not erased, and over time that distance became a fixed part of Paul's life, something he no longer tried to change. This did not come with resentment, but with a quiet acceptance that there were relationships, no matter how important, that could not return to their original form. In the quiet space of the present, music still existed, but no longer held the central role as before. He still played guitar, still wrote, but no longer with the goal of releasing, no longer with the pressure to be heard by millions. Music returned to a more original, closer form, the way it had once come to him in the early years, not to prove anything, but to keep a connection with himself. There were melodies written that were never completed, lyrics that existed only in a moment and then vanished, and this time he did not feel the need to keep everything. Silence, which he had once tried to fill, now became a part of life he learned to accept. Not an empty silence, but a space where he did not need to find answers for everything. There were questions that remained, but he no longer felt the need to resolve them immediately. And in this change, there was a kind of peace that was not completely whole, but enough for him to continue existing without fighting against himself. Paul Simon's life did not end with a big moment, but with a prolonged settling, where everything gradually became lighter, slower, and less noisy. No more lights, no more constant attention, only a person and what he had carried throughout his life, now placed in a space that no one else could define for him. When life had settled down to the point where there was almost nothing left to prove, Paul Simon looked back at his journey not as a series of clear victories or failures, but as a long flow where everything blended together, The youthful years full of longing, the days standing under bright lights, the relationships that came and went, and the silences that no one but him could fully understand. There was no single moment that could represent that entire life, no simple story that could contain everything he had been through. But if there was one thing that remained, one thing that time had not blurred, it was the songs. Not just as musical works, but as parts of himself that he had shared with the world. The melodies he had once written in uncertain moments, the words formed from thoughts that were never spoken out loud, all of it was still there, living in the memories of those who had once listened, who had once found themselves in it. Paul Simon's legacy did not lie in the number of awards or recognition, but in the fact that he had created something that went beyond himself, something that continued to exist even when he was no longer at its center. And in all of that, he was not a perfect person. He had made choices that were not always right, relationships he could not hold on to, distances he did not know how to close. He did not always understand others, and he did not always understand himself. But perhaps it was precisely that imperfection that made his story more truthful, because it reflected something many people do not say, that a life can be full yet still lacking, can be successful yet still carry unanswered questions. Even though he was no longer at the center of attention, even though he was no longer shaping the flow of music as before, Paul Simon continued to exist, not as an unchanging symbol, but as a person living the rest of his life in the quietest way. He no longer needed to prove anything, no longer needed to surpass anyone, even himself. What remained was not the lights, not the applause, but the ability to look back without turning away, the ability to accept what had been lost without denying what had been gained. And perhaps, in that settling, in letting everything return to its rightful place, he found a form of peace that was not perfect, but real enough to exist. When everything else gradually faded, what remained was not greatness in the way the world defines it, but the trace of a person who had lived, who had searched, who had made mistakes, who had continued, and left behind not only music, but a feeling that others could recognize in their own lives. Looking back at Paul Simon's entire journey, what remains is not only admiration, but also a very deep, very quiet sadness, a feeling of compassion for a person who had spent his whole life listening to the world, but was not easily understood in return. From childhood, in an intellectual family that lacked emotional connection, where he learned to stay silent and observe, to the relationship with Art Garfunkel, a friendship that was both a support and a long-lasting wound, we clearly see a person who always stood between connection and loss. When success came to Simon and Garfunkel, the spotlight did not bring wholeness, but instead revealed the imbalance, when Paul was the one who wrote but was not always fully recognized. And then, when he stepped into his solo career, he still achieved great success. But as the story itself has shown, it was success without someone to share it with, a form of loneliness that not everyone understands. The relationship with Carrie Fisher made this even clearer, a deep love that could not be kept, because he could not fully express his emotions, while she could not live in that silence. Even when he found stability with Edie Brickell, the inner cracks still existed. And when old age came, along with the gradual loss of hearing and having to leave the stage, he was forced to face a painful truth. The thing that had defined him throughout his life was gradually moving away. This story is not a tragedy in the usual way, but a profound reminder for American society, where success is often measured by fame and achievements, that a person can achieve everything the world praises, yet still carry voids that cannot be filled. The lesson is not in avoiding failure, but in learning how to maintain real connections, learning how to speak emotions while it is still possible, and understanding that the value of a life lies not only in what we create, but also in the way we are present with those around us. If Paul Simon's story made you pause, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. as a way to send thanks to the person who spent his whole life turning silences into music. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone sees.